Before I start talking about Sonic Prime, I want to talk a little bit about the conversation surrounding the show, and one aspect of it in particular that really stands out to me as a big point of contention amongst many fans, and that would be Sonic Prime being canon to the games. The official word is that Sonic Prime is canon. However, if you're a crazy, weirdo, hardcore Sonic fan like me, then you notice many a problem with that being the case. There are many little things, many instances, many lines that are wrong if this is supposed to be canon. For example, in Season 1, Sonic talks about the tornado being Tails' plane when it's actually his plane. Also in Season 1, Sonic is surprised that Eggman's robots are not powered by animals. Or when Sonic encounters Chaos Sonic for the first time in Season 2, he acts like he's never seen a Sonic robot in his entire life before. And throughout the entire show, there's this weird depiction of Green Hill as seemingly the setting of the entire Sonic series, like Green Hill is all that there is. The characters talk about, we have to get back Green Hill in particular, and it seems like all the characters live in Green Hill, which Green Hill is just one particular place in the Sonic universe in the games, and it's not that important. But here in this show, it seems like it's everything, which is very strange and incongruent with the games. There's also the fact that Sonic goes to all these different worlds and sees characters that look like his friends but aren't actually his friends, and he takes quite a while to pick up on that, even though in the Sonic Storybook games, he's already dealt with this kind of thing before, so you'd think he would have figured it out a little bit more quickly. Many little nerd things like that I could pick apart of, well, actually that's wrong and that doesn't fit, that's inconsistent, blah 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 blah. But by far, the biggest inconsistency that a lot of people seem to have a really big problem with is the characterization, particularly of Sonic. Sonic in this show is very out of character. He doesn't act anything like Game Sonic, many people will tell you. And because of that, and things like what I've talked about this point, many people have dismissed Sonic Prime as being canon. It's not canon. The characters act completely differently, and there are all these inconsistencies, so no, it's not canon, they're lying, it's not true. But to that, I pose a simple question. Since when has inconsistent characterization and continuity errors ever made something non-canon to Sonic? I don't know if you've ever played a Sonic game before, but pretty much every single game, starting with Sonic Adventure, has some kind of inconsistency or continuity error with previous games. And the characters in the games have had their characterizations changed multiple times. I don't see anyone saying that Sonic Colors is not canon because everyone acts like completely different people, or how in Sonic Frontiers they also act like completely different people, even from the completely different people that they were in the previous games. Really, as far as being canon is considered, Sonic Prime doesn't do anything worse than the games have done for decades at this point. But the real thing about this whole discussion is that it's just stupid and pointless. You want to know the real truth about Sonic Prime being canon or not? Okay, here's what it is. The canon of Sonic doesn't actually exist. It's a bunch of bullshit. It doesn't matter. And you're better off ignoring the official word on what is and is not canon, because it's all meaningless garbage. Apparently, Sonic Prime takes place sometime after Sonic Advance 3. Okay, well, A, that doesn't work because of all the inconsistencies that I pointed out earlier, plus more that I haven't even mentioned. And B, who cares? What does that matter? Does that make the story of Sonic Prime better? Does that make the story of any Sonic game better? No, it doesn't do anything. The only thing it accomplishes is create all of these inconsistencies that fans then point out and go, that's wrong, blah 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 blah. The word canon in Sonic is seemingly used these days as a marketing term. They know there's a very large portion of Sonic fans that are really interested in the canon for whatever reason, and so if they just say, hey, Sonic Prime is canon, then suddenly that creates a bunch of interest in the show where other people would ignore it otherwise, and same goes for the comics. Oh yeah, they're definitely canon, so you should buy them and read them. when in reality it means nothing. Clearly that's the case, because Sonic Prime is allegedly canon, yet has all these inconsistencies and continuity errors with the games, so what does being canon even mean? What does it matter? It doesn't, exactly. It's just a term they threw out there so people would pay more attention to the show. When in reality, when you look at the show and what it is, it's very clear that from a production perspective, the people that were making the show were not trying to make something that fit within the game universe of Sonic. They took cues from the games and used them as heavy reference material to make something that felt relatively in line with the games, but they were very clearly doing their own thing, making their own interpretation of Sonic. And so that is the lens with which I view Sonic Prime. I don't give a shit if this is supposed to be canon, and I don't give a shit if this is supposed to be the same Sonic from the games. When I watch the show, it does not feel like the same world as the games, and it does not feel like the same Sonic, so I just compartmentalize it. This is its own thing. This is a separate Sonic, a separate universe, separate everything, and it's just a show based on the Sonic games doing its own thing. And in that lens, all of those inconsistencies, all those continuity errors, and Sonic's characterization not being how I would like it to be, none of that matters. Of course Sonic doesn't act like he does in the games here. This is a different Sonic. This show isn't trying to be game accurate, it's doing its own thing, so I'm going to let it do its own thing, and take it at face value for what it actually is. I've seen so many Sonic fans criticizing Sonic Prime specifically because they don't like Sonic's characterization, because this isn't Sonic, he doesn't act anything like Sonic, he's super out of character. But really, he's not out of character, because this isn't the same Sonic, it's a different Sonic. Anything else they tried to feed us is very clearly lies, and I ignore that. Would I prefer something that was more authentic to the games? Yes, absolutely, but at the same time, if we're talking about Sonic is out of character or whatever, Sonic has been out of character since 2010. It's been over a decade since we saw the real Sonic, or most of the cast for that matter, and quite frankly, I've accepted that the real Sonic is dead, and we're probably never going to see it again. They've done it, they've worn me down, and I don't give a shit anymore. At this point, if I can get a Sonic thing and it's good, I'll take it, and if it somehow resembles real Sonic, that's a surprising bonus. That's how I view the Sonic series these days. And I felt that was important to get out of the way up front here, because it is going to very heavily inform my opinion of Sonic Prime, because I've seen a lot of other hardcore Sonic fans be much more harsh on this show than I'm going to be for the kinds of things that I've stated up to this point. But getting over all of those things, and how it's not real Sonic, and how it's not canon, or blah blah blah, whatever, we put all that to the side and just look at this as a show to watch, I must say that I quite enjoyed Sonic Prime. I thought it was pretty good, had some flaws for sure, and we'll get into that, but honestly, overall, I would have to say that this is possibly the best dedicated Sonic storytelling that we've gotten outside of a game from any of the official stuff, at least from what I've seen. I haven't read very many Sonic comics, but as far as cartoons, movies, even anime, I really do think Sonic Prime is the best. There are some things that other shows do better. I think that Sonic X is really, really good, but Sonic X is also extremely flawed. Whereas Sonic Prime might not hit the highs of Sonic X, but it also doesn't have nearly as low of lows. I would say overall, the show maintains a relatively high level of quality, and I was engaged for just about every single episode of the show. In fact, as I was watching it, those episodes felt like they were just flying by because I was so into it and enjoying it so much. But now let's get into things in a little bit more detail. Just so you know, I'm not going to be doing like a full recap of the entire plot of the whole show because that would take forever. But there will be full spoilers here, so be warned. I guess I'll try to break it down into the different seasons and tackle each one as a piece. I did a video of my first impressions of Season 1, so I'm going to try to get through this relatively quickly and not retread on the same topics too much. Season 1 of Sonic Prime was probably my favorite, actually. I quite enjoyed it. What I really liked about the show overall is that it feels a lot like the kind of plot and premise that we would see in a Sonic game. You know, Eggman finds something and he's trying to get his hands on it, and Sonic goes to stop him, but then things go wrong and now we end up in this crazy, weird situation, and Sonic has to go on a big adventure to fix it. Unlike so many other previous Sonic shows that are like slice of life, this had a continual plot the entire time, where Sonic is working towards fixing the problem throughout the whole story, and that makes it feel so much more like a Sonic game. And other story aspects contribute to that as well. Having all these different worlds that Sonic is going to, you could easily imagine that as, you know, different zones or different themed worlds that we're visiting at different parts of the game. Sonic's shoes and how they change as he goes to different worlds and they grant him different abilities feels like perfect for video game power-up stuff. And I really like the concept of it, of Sonic having shoes that grant him different abilities. It's kind of weird they haven't done that much in the games. And I think it works out really well when you see Sonic running and he has the peel-out legs and they're different colors based on the shoes that he's wearing. Like, that's so smart, and it looks really cool. I really like that detail. And I particularly liked how a lot of aspects of this show, in many ways, did feel fairly true to Sonic to me. Like, there was a lot of, admittedly, in-your-face environmental theming going on with Green Hill and the beauty of what it was, and how the Chaos Council has ruined that and turned it into all this machinery and city and stuff, and they want to restore it back to how it was. How the Rebellion, their beacon of hope, is the palm tree, you know, and when you get to the Boss Cage maze and you have Thorn Rose and she's like really going crazy, is like super environmentalist and kind of pushing it too far, and then Sonic helps her realize that it's not about one or the other, you gotta achieve a good balance. Like, all of that felt very true to the original environmental themes of Sonic, which is something that we don't really see that much of these days in Sonic, and I was very pleased to see that that was woven into the DNA of the show. It wasn't the main focus, but it was there as just a background element that was present throughout the whole thing, and that felt so very fitting for Sonic. And I have to say, the premise here of the Shadowverse and having all these different worlds with all these different versions of these characters, at first that was something that I was really not into because I am so done with multiverses. Jesus Christ, fucking everything is doing multiverses and I cannot stand it anymore. I never want to see a fucking character interact with another version of themselves again. But I found it relatively tolerable here in Sonic Prime, and I think that is in large part thanks to the fact that the main versions of most of our cast are not present in this show. It's just Sonic and Shadow, and all the other main characters are gone, and all we have are these alternate versions of them. And Sonic and Shadow do not have alternate versions, so we don't see that annoying shit of characters interacting with alternate versions of themselves. We see Sonic interacting with all these characters that resemble the Sonic characters, but are not quite them, and that was much more interesting than how a lot of this fucking annoying multiverse crap is handled these days, so I was actually pretty okay with it. Especially considering we got some character arcs in this show that took advantage of the fact that we are using alternate versions of familiar Sonic characters, how 9 is kind of like an inversion of Tails. If Tails never had Sonic there to support him, then he goes in a very different direction, pushing people away, leaning into his technology, becoming very self-interested. And at first, he is very off-put by Sonic and the idea of friends and trusting people, but over time, Sonic manages to get him to open up, and it's kind of, you know, getting this version of Tails that's been sent on the wrong path, getting him closer to the actual Tails, getting him more like how he was always supposed to be. And as I already said, Thorn Rose has a really nice character arc in Season 1 where she's going too far with the environmentalism, and Sonic helps her realize that. But what I especially liked is that Sonic helps her realize the error of her ways thanks to a lesson that Amy taught him earlier in the show. So in reality, it was Amy helping a version of herself that had strayed off course get back on track, and that is just so appropriate for Amy. And I also quite like the idea of the Chaos Council, how we have all these different characters in all these different universes, but for whatever reason, it's never explained in the show, and I actually was surprised by that. We have all 5 Eggmans all in the same world, and because of that, it's, 5 times the threat. We have 5 times the egg that we have to deal with, and so they were able to completely take over their world. And Season 1 ended up going in a pretty interesting direction, with the Chaos Council now having the ability to travel to different worlds, so now they want to take over the entire Shadowverse, and I was like, oh man, this threat is quite serious here. This is getting pretty cool. I also like Rusty Rose, how she is their enforcer, and obviously they set up a character change for her. And we also have a character arc with Captain Dread, the Knuckles of the pirate world, and that also leads into things that are set up for the future. So I think Season 1 ended up in a really good place where it had some interesting stuff that it explored, and then it expanded it in cool ways and left a really big open book for Season 2 to then expand on more. And I have to say, I was a little disappointed in the direction that the show ended up going based on what we had seen throughout Season 1. Not because it was bad, but because I thought it was going in one particular direction, and I thought that would have been really cool, and it ended up not going in that direction at all. Because looking at Season 1, there's a pretty clear pattern of getting a world dedicated to one of our major Sonic characters. New York City was dedicated to 9, he gets a major character arc. Boss Cage Maze was dedicated to Thorn, she gets a major character arc. And the pirate world, that I forget what it was called, was dedicated to Captain Dread, and he gets a character arc, so I assumed that we would be getting one world dedicated to each of Sonic's friends, so I figured there was going to be one more world that we would go to, where we would have some other altered versions of the characters, and that would be the world where we focus on the Rouge of that world, and she would get a character arc. But that didn't end up happening, and I was quite disappointed by that. Rouge kind of feels like a second-class character because of that in this show, and that's quite unfortunate. I was also really weirded out by the fact that, with this being a Shatterverse, I assumed that this multiverse was because the normal world of Sonic was shattered and broken into different pieces, so I figured that all these different worlds, all these different versions of the characters that we have are pieces of them that have been splintered, and the progression of the show would be that the characters would come together and eventually reform into the original characters that they were always supposed to be, but that's not what ended up happening. Instead, these are just completely separate worlds, which is really strange. It doesn't feel like what the show was setting up for. Very weird direction that it ended up going with that. But now getting into Season 2, they shift the focus quite a bit. Season 1 was definitely dedicated primarily to introducing us to the setting, the concepts, all the different worlds, all the different versions of the characters, and the general premise of what we're gonna be doing here. Season 2 was like, okay, now that all of our pieces are in place, let's start really moving the plot. Because now we had an actual dedicated goal and some more understanding of what's going on. Sonic needs to collect all of the shards of the Paradox Prism to put it back together so that way he can restore his world. So instead of him hopping from world to world to world and having all of these small little adventures in that world to help out a character, now it's much more of a multiverse. We're going back and forth to all kinds of different universes, trying to collect all of the shards. So it was a really big change in the pacing and the feel compared to Season 1. And as I said, I was a little bit disappointed by this because I wanted one more world where we would get a Rouge character arc. Sadly, that didn't happen. But overall, I think that this ended up working out pretty well because after the revelation of all the Chaos Council is hopping dimensions, now this feels like an escalation of the plot. We have a much bigger threat now that we have to deal with, so we have to deal with it in a very different way. We gotta really focus on what the core issue is, which is collecting these shards and keeping it out of their hands. And now we have this cast of characters that we've grown to know and befriended, and we can rely on them and use them as allies to help accomplish this goal. And so it's the beginnings of the characters starting to come together, team up, and all work towards one singular goal. And Season 2 is also where we start to get to see a little bit more of Shadow. And I find Shadow's use in this show hilarious because it's very clear that he's been given the Goku syndrome of Shadow is just too powerful of a character because he can do anything Sonic can do, but he also has Chaos powers on top of that. So he's basically just a better Sonic, but this is a Sonic show, and so we want to focus on Sonic. So we have to make Shadow unavailable. We have to incapacitate him so he can't contribute to the plot too significantly. So throughout Season 1, he's just like trapped between the universes, and in Season 2, we get a little bit more from him at the beginning of the show, but still he's very limited in what he's allowed to do. Mainly he's there for exposition and helping us understand what's going on, and then he does some cool stuff in the finale because Shadow's cool and we want to see cool stuff from Shadow. But then throughout the whole, like, middle 90% of Season 2, he's just back to being in the background, not really doing very much. I understand from a writing perspective why this has to be this way, and to be honest, I found it kind of funny. But it is quite a shame, Shadow being such a fan-favorite character, to see him pushed off to the sidelines. I don't know what it is with Sonic these days. Shadow is the second most popular Sonic character, even more popular than Tails. People freaking love Shadow. And not just in this show, but in modern Sonic material in general, Shadow just never really gets a lot of time in the spotlight. It's very weird that you would not lean into a fan-favorite character and give us a lot of him. They just do not want to use this character very much. It's really weird. Though I do have to say, that fight between Sonic and Shadow in Episode 1 of Season 2, pretty fucking sick. The animation in this show, in general, is really good. By far the best animation we've ever seen in any Sonic cartoon or anime or anything. And that one fight in particular really goes hard, and I was all about it. It was actually, like, legitimately awesome, and it really felt like the real Sonic and the real Shadow, when they fight, this is what it really looks like. Them zipping all over the place, spin dashing into each other. The fight spans this giant area as they're chasing after each other. It was so cool. Though I do have to point out, the fight was actually completely pointless and was just padding and filler and didn't actually contribute anything to the story. Because the fight there was Shadow wanted to get the little power controller things that Sonic had on his gloves and shoes so that way he could start going into alternate worlds and take things into his own hands. But then he actually can't do that. It was just a theory. He thought he'd be able to do it with those, but he actually couldn't. So then he just gives them back to Sonic, and Sonic continues with what he was gonna do anyway. So that entire fight was a giant waste of time and only existed so we could have a really cool action set piece in the first episode of the new season. And as that, it was very effective, but from a writing and storytelling perspective, it was completely pointless. While we're talking about Shadow, I do want to mention that I was actually pleasantly surprised with his characterization in this show. Shadow here is more like the real Shadow than he's been in forever, and I quite enjoyed that. He is still a little bit off. We do get quite a bit of angry Shadow in Season 1 of the show, but in Season 2 and 3, he's generally better, still a little bit off, but pretty good. The fact that he doesn't trust Sonic to get things done and he wants to handle everything by himself is something that would be inconsistent if the Sonic of this show was like the Sonic from the games. But considering this Sonic and what he's like, it actually makes perfect sense that Shadow would not trust him and not rely on him. So that actually ended up feeling very in character for Shadow, which was surprising. Again, like I said before, when something actually resembles real Sonic, it's a pleasant surprise to me, and Shadow was actually a pleasant surprise here, even if he was still ever so slightly off. By the way, another one of those inconsistencies that I could have pointed out earlier is Shadow losing his Chaos Emerald here in Season 2, meaning he no longer can do Chaos Control. That is something that has been very inconsistent throughout the Sonic games. In some games, Shadow needs a Chaos Emerald to do Chaos Control, and in other games, he can just do Chaos Control on his own whenever he wants. So, I guess this show goes with the version of Shadow that requires a Chaos Emerald, which is inconsistent with the most recent depictions of him in the games and such. So, there you go, there's another one. Anyway, as for the rest of Season 2, I thought it was pretty good. We get a lot of universe hopping, revisiting areas from before, but now the Chaos Council is here trying to get the shard. Sonic shows up, and he tries to get the characters that he's helped in the past to now help him out, and it adds some weight to what's going on here. We also incorporate the Captain Dread stuff that was set up in Season 1 about him being obsessed with his treasure that he's now finally gotten, now that he's got his pirating spirit back. Meanwhile, 9, who's been captured by the Chaos Council, is working from behind the scenes to try to sabotage and make everything work out in the end, because, oh no, things aren't going well, and the Chaos Council is collecting more and more shards, making them more and more powerful. One thing I definitely do have to criticize this show for, though, is a very clear lack of budget for asset creation. Because we end up fighting the same things over and over and over throughout this show. Obviously, we have all of the generic Eggman robots, which is just copy and paste of the same model over and over, but that's relatively okay. Some more variety in different Eggman robot types would have been nice, but it's not the end of the world. But it was much more noticeable with the Chaos Council and their mechs that we keep on fighting repeatedly. Like, the baby has, like, his big egg robot that he's constantly in, and we fight that thing throughout the show, like, 6 freaking times. And the one hipster Eggman, he's got his samurai armor and everything. We just keep on revisiting these same things over and over. Meanwhile, the old man Eggman does not have a mech that he gets to be his own thing, neither does the teenage version of him, and that feels very much like we didn't have the budget to make unique robots for all these different Eggmans, so the teenager can control the robots remotely, and the grandpa, he pilots the ships. That'll be his thing. It really does feel kind of cheap. And yeah, there are other aspects of the show that are like that. The fact that we keep on revisiting these same locations over and over obviously is part of that as well, but that is relatively tolerable because we have this setting, and I kind of like that it's in this limited space of all these different multiverses. That kind of feels okay to me, but the lack of diversity in enemies that the characters end up fighting definitely is a big problem for me. But the new enemy that we do get introduced to in Season 2 is Chaos Sonic, and it's fine. I'm okay with it. It's a Metal Sonic evil robot Sonic copy thing, and their version of it here, I think it works for the Sonic that we have in this show. How he is always talking and making a lot of dumb jokes, and he is very juvenile and things, and so Chaos Sonic is like an extreme exaggeration of that. And I think that works for the most part. I'm not particularly in love with Chaos Sonic, but it's fine enough. I don't really have much of an issue with it. It's kind of a little bit lame that it's introduced and dealt with in the span of just a single episode, but it's more so there to set up for things going on in Season 3, so I guess that's okay. And then we get to the final act of Season 3, where our heroes manage to escape from the Chaos Council with all of the shards, and they go to, what is it, Ghost Hill, they ended up calling it, and trying to put the shard back together, and 9 is doing that while Sonic and Shadow have to fend off the Chaos Council, and you get a lot of cool action there, and of course it ends up with Sonic getting powered up by the Paradox Prism, and that's pretty cool, kind of doing a supersonic thing, but not really supersonic, which once again makes the show feel very similar to the storybook games, with Sonic visiting all these different worlds, seeing characters that look like his friends but aren't his friends, and then he gets kind of a super form that's not a super form, but it's functionally the same thing. It was pretty cool. I liked it. And then they defeat the Chaos Council, and everything's looking good. But then we get introduced into the main premise for Season 3, which is that 9 doesn't want to restore Green Hill. Now that he's made this bond with Sonic, he wants to return to the Grim and turn that into the perfect world for just him and Sonic to be in together. And Sonic's not down with that, and they have an argument. And then 9 goes off with the Prism, and he's like, "Fuck you, Sonic." And I have to say, this was really obvious. I saw this coming from way back in Episode 1 of Season 2. When Shadow is talking with Sonic about how all these versions of the characters, they're not real, and specifically when he says, "Do you really trust 9?" And the moment he said that, I saw the entire plot of the rest of the story in my head of, okay, restoring Green Hill is gonna mean destroying all these worlds as they get fused back together, which that part I was actually wrong about. But obviously 9 isn't going to want that to happen, and he's built this connection with Sonic, so he's going to want to be with him, and he's talking about the Grim and how much he likes it, so then he's going to turn into the main villain, and we're going to have to stop him and teach him a lesson, and all the people are going to team up to fight 9, and I bet you the Chaos Council are going to end up fighting against him as well. And, yeah, that's all. Exactly where Season 3 ended up going. Very, very predictable, but I'm not gonna hold it against this show that much. I think it was still relatively well done, but they spelled it out way too obviously before that moment at the end of Season 2. And Season 3 of Sonic Prime, I liked it, but over time I found myself kind of liking it less and less. I think it starts off pretty strong, and it stays pretty strong for a while, but there are some issues, because, you know, now that 9 has the Paradox Prism, he has ultimate power and control of the Shatterverse, and so he starts making his perfect world in the Grim, and that's all cool. But that is causing all the other worlds to fall apart, and so everyone has to come together into New York City and get under this barrier by the Chaos Council, and they have to be convinced into working together, and Sonic is going to use his Paradox Prism power to power their thing, which I totally predicted as well. We go on some adventures to rescue the last couple of remaining members who have not been recruited yet, and that's kind of fun. We get to see the characters starting to meet up with their alternate versions of themselves, and that's you get some fun interactions out of that. We also introduce the Grim versions of the characters, all of the Metal Sonic equivalents, one for Knuckles, Amy, Rouge, and even Birdie, and that's kind of cool. I like that idea. We've not really had that kind of thing before in Sonic outside of Sonic R, I guess, and I guess technically Superstars now. But, you know, getting that as an actual story thing was pretty cool, and having, like, an upgraded new version of a Metal Sonic, especially early on when they first go to the Grim and it's Sonic and Shadow together versus this Metal Sonic. That was pretty cool. I feel like they don't utilize the fact that Shadow is also a copy of Sonic nearly as much as they could in this show. They mention it, like, once. 9 mentions that Shadow looks like he could be a twin of Sonic, which was surprising to me, actually. They haven't mentioned the fact that Sonic and Shadow are supposed to look the same since, I think, Sonic Heroes. So it was actually kind of neat to see that referenced again. I feel like they could have done more with it, but was not to be, I suppose. And yeah, predictably, everybody ends up teaming up. They go to the Grim to confront 9, and we get a very Sonic Forces finale going on, where we have this army of all of our characters versus an army of copy and paste character models, as 9 makes a bunch of duplicates of all of his metal robot copies. And I found that very amusing, the similarities to Sonic Forces, but also, I gotta say, this is like 10,000 times better than Sonic Forces managed to pull this off. And we get a big war thing, lots of characters fighting each other, and there's a lot of cool action throughout Season 3. But this is where things start to waver a little bit, because this final battle goes on for way longer than it needs to. The story kind of ends up spinning its tires here for a while, where we have to get to 9, we have to stop him, but he's got all these robots, so we gotta deal with them, we gotta get past them, and 9 is trying to get Sonic to come to him so he can pull the Paradox power out of him, so he can complete his world or whatever. And it's just this constant repeating back and forth of 9 trying to bait Sonic into coming after him, and he doesn't, and then 9 baits Sonic into trying to come after him, and then he doesn't, and then it ultimately just ends up that he does go right directly to 9, so what the fuck was the point of having that same story beat repeated so many times? But then when Sonic and 9 are finally facing off, we repeat the same story beat again over and over, of just them going back and forth arguing with each other. Of, you know, 9 was like, you just want Green Hill back, you don't care about me, and he's like, no, 9, you're wrong, I care about you, I care about everybody, shut up, no, you're lying, no, listen to me, you're my friend, just looping the same thing over and over and over and over, just so we can get even more action into this scene. And yeah, it's an action show, but the action needs to serve a purpose and push the story forward. Here, the story was stalling, so we can just cram as much action as possible into the finale of the show. And yeah, you want to have a big action-packed cool finale, but eventually, at a certain point, if you keep on throwing more and more and more action, people just start to get disinterested, and that did start to happen a little bit. The action is all still fine, but it's very repetitive because it's the characters all fighting in this same location for episode after episode, fighting this identical army of copy and pasted characters over and over and over again. And there's cool little moments here and there We have the alternate Tailses working together to create some gadgets and mess with things in ways that 9 didn't expect. And I really love the Amy's in this show. The 3 Amy's end up really bonding together, and they call each other sisters, and they really work together way better than any of the other characters in their equivalent versions. And I really love that. It feels very fitting for Amy that her versions are the ones that particularly connect with each other and feel that bond. The Amy's in this show are, like, my favorite part of it by far. And we have the giant robot Big that comes in, and then Shadow gets involved in the final battle, and there's all these cool little moments, but it's just too much, man. You could have chopped an entire episode of fighting off of that final battle, and it probably would have improved the pacing of the show dramatically. Really, the only significant major story beat we needed in that final battle was how Sonic wanted to go and confront 9 directly, but he stopped himself and said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to listen to my friends and we'll form a plan and do this in the smart way. Because that was the whole inciting incident of Sonic Prime, is Sonic not working together with his friends, not being part of a team, just going in there, doing his own thing, not listening to other people, and that's what had him break the Paradox Prism and get this whole situation going in the first place. So this is now Sonic getting his character arc. He spent all this time with all these characters, bonding with them, relying on their help for many things. There are a lot of parts in Season 2 where he's like, you know, guys, this is really dangerous. If you want, I'll handle it myself. And they're like, no, we're with you, Sonic. That happened lots throughout Season 2, really reinforcing that. And now we have this moment where Sonic is going to rely on his friends and work together for a bigger goal. And that's great, and that sets up Sonic's character arc pretty nicely. And that's all you really needed. We didn't need all this extra fighting after it. And then even after we defeat 9 and he realizes the error of his ways, they still try to cram in even more action. We're at the final moment. Oh wait, no, the Chaos Council are gonna take the prism, but then they just turned that into a joke, and that was okay. But then at the end, when Sonic is like, oh no, he needs to be returned back to Green Hill, we have to get him back there before he disappears or whatever. And it's like, really? At the final end moment after we've won the day, we're gonna have one final little action scene with some tension, and like, this is completely unnecessary. We do not need this. It really felt like there was some executive or something going, we need more action in the show. Put in more action. So many action scenes. As many fucking action scenes as you can cram into the final season as possible. And because most of it is the final battle, there is a lot more fighting in the final season than there was in previous seasons. A disproportionately high amount, which I'm not really a fan of. Season 1 did a pretty good job of having a variety of action scenes. Season 2 less so, but it was still okay. Season 3 is just fighting, 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 and more fighting. And I have to say, I find the end state of the show to be very strange, and the resolution was way too rushed and not satisfying at all. Because, okay, Sonic and Shadow return to their normal world, and that's fine, and Sonic has learned his lesson now, so we go back to that opening action scene, and he works together with his friends, and they defeat Eggman and stop him from getting the Paradox Prison. And Shadow shows up and Chaos controls it to who knows where, so it won't be a problem in the future, resolving that whole conflict, and that's a really good ending for our main cast. But what about all the other characters, because they still exist in the Shatterverse, right? It is extremely bizarre that after spending so many time with these other characters in these different worlds and trying to help them overcome all these different conflicts, we don't get to see a resolution to that. We don't get to go to Boss Cage Maze and see Thorn now living together with the Scavengers without, you know, being a freak about things. That we don't get to see Captain Dread and his crew going back on their pirating adventures. That we don't get to see the Rebellion, now that the Chaos Council has been defeated, restore their world back to the beautiful nature before the Chaos Council showed up. And 9 especially is really weird because his whole thing is that he wanted to be alone in the Grim, away from everybody that had hurt him, and he wanted to be there together with Sonic, but he's satisfied just being alone by himself in the Grim. Which is weird as fuck that you would leave that character in that position. He wanted to be alone because he was pushing everyone away due to the trauma he'd experienced in his past, So you would think the resolution for his character would be that he would learn that it's okay to trust in others and make friends, and you don't have to be alone. You don't have to stay in the Grim in this little isolated bubble that you create for yourself. You can come back to New York City, and you can be friends with Rebel and Nux and everybody. You don't have to push people away and be alone anymore. And they just don't do that. They leave it on a note of 9 is gonna stay alone in the Grim, and everybody just let him be. And it's like, what the fuck? That's how we're ending the story? That is so bizarre. For the main villain, and really the main character arc of the show, 9 was the central focus of this whole thing. For his primary character dilemma to not be properly addressed is so weird. I honestly have no idea what they were thinking with that finale. It feels so unsatisfying for that character. What a strange ending, man. Like, everything worked out for Sonic and Shadow, and fuck everybody else. Fuck all the characters that we've been spending 24 episodes with up to this point. Weird. 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 And it kinda left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth at the end, but overall, when I look at the show as a whole, I do still think that Sonic Prime was fairly good, and for the most part, things were very well done. It's just a little bit towards, like, the second half of Season 3 that things start to fall off. But besides that, I really enjoyed the show, and I would absolutely recommend it to Sonic fans. I don't know if I would recommend it to non-Sonic fans, though, honestly. It's not like it's the most amazing, incredible show you've ever seen in your life. It's a fairly standard kids action-adventure show, and it really relies a lot on Sonic stuff that it doesn't explain that much. Like, it doesn't explain what Chaos Emeralds are or what Chaos Control is. It does a very poor job of establishing the major characters before the Shadowverse splitting. So this really does feel like a show made for Sonic fans, which I guess as a Sonic fan, I can appreciate that. But it is a bit weird that they wouldn't try to target more of general audiences with this thing and try more to get people up to speed. And the show is a little bit more on the kiddie side than I wish it was, but, you know, Sonic is a kid's series, so I guess that's not too surprising. And, yeah, that's Sonic Prime. I liked it. I thought it was good. I thought it was quite good, as a matter of fact. If it wasn't for those pacing issues and the very unsatisfying resolution at the end of Season 3, I would have probably been willing to say this is a great show, but that does harm it a little bit. Still, though, I was very, very pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed Sonic Prime. It's been a long time since I enjoyed any kind of storytelling in official Sonic media, but this was good. I liked it. I am here for it. I would be very down for the team behind this show to get to do a follow-up sequel series. Doesn't have to involve Shadowverse, just, you know, same universe of this version of Sonic, and come in with a new premise and a new big story spanning 24 episodes. I would totally watch that. I think this team has the chops to make it work. Just don't mess up the ending next time.